In the spring of 1979, every farmer in Calhoun County, Nebraska, laughed at Vivian Marsh. They laughed at the grain elevator in Albion. They laughed at the counter of the hardware store on 3rd Street. They laughed at the booth in the back of May's Diner where the men gathered on Tuesday mornings before the co-op opened. They laughed at the cattle sale barn in Fullerton, and at the seed dealership, and at the Methodist Church potluck in April. Vivian Marsh had spent the previous winter reading soil biology textbooks from the University of Nebraska Extension Library, and she had come to the conclusion that she was never going to plow her fields again. Not just the back 40, not just the low ground near the creek where the tractor always bogged down anyway. All of it. Every acre. The whole 280-acre dryland farm her husband Gerald had left her when he died of a stroke in October of 1977, 41 years old. Sitting in that same tractor seat he had sat in every spring since his father had handed him the keys at 18. The county had one word for it: grief. Vivian was 38 years old. She had no sons old enough to take over. She had a daughter named Claire who was 16 and wanted to study nursing in Omaha. She had a banknote with $31,000 left on it. She had a John Deere 4430 with 4,200 hours on the engine. She had 400 acres of Platte River bottom soil, half of it the finest dryland corn ground in Colfax County, and she was going to stop turning it over every spring. The farmers of Calhoun County laughed for 3 months. Then they laughed for 5 more years. They stopped laughing in the summer of 1984, when a drought that the old-timers said reminded them of the 1930s came down through the Great Plains and burned through 6 counties in a row, and when somebody started noticing something that didn't make sense. There was one farm in the area where the soil didn't blow, where the corn, even in July with no rain for 31 days, had not yet rolled its leaves, where the ground between the rows was dark and soft when every other field in the township had turned to pale, cracked hardpan. It was Vivian Marsh's farm, and nobody could explain it except Vivian, and Vivian had been trying to explain it for 5 years while everyone was laughing. Let her take you back to where it started. Let her show you what she stopped doing. Let her show you who laughed. Vivian Nowak was born in 1941 in Columbus, Nebraska, the second of 3 children of a man named Frank Nowak, who had come from Poland in 2020 and had spent his entire American life trying to understand why the soil on the farm he bought in Platte County got a little worse every decade no matter how much fertilizer he put on it. Frank Nowak had a 6th-grade education and a habit of reading every agricultural pamphlet the Extension office sent him, and then reading them again. He kept them in a cardboard box under his workbench. By the time Vivian was 12, the box had 4 layers in it, and Frank had started writing his own notes in the margins. Frank believed the soil was alive. He didn't have the vocabulary for it in the early 1950s. He didn't know the word mycorrhizal or the phrase soil microbiome, but he had noticed that the corner of his east field where he had always piled the old corn stalks and left them to rot grew better corn than anywhere else on the farm without any additional fertilizer. He had noticed that the ground along his fence rows, where the tractor never went, was darker and looser than the ground in the middle of the field. He had tried to tell this to the other farmers at the elevator in Columbus, and they had listened with the polite patience of men who have already made up their minds. Frank told Vivian in 1959, when she was 18 and about to leave for a 2-year program at the Agricultural College in Lincoln, that the problem with modern farming was that it was fighting the soil instead of feeding it. She wrote it down. She went to Lincoln. She came back with a practical certificate in agricultural science and a husband named Gerald Marsh, who had grown up on a farm near Humphrey and who plowed deep and planted straight and was by any measure of his time and place a good farmer. Vivian showed Gerald her father's notes once in 1963. Gerald read them carefully, the way a man reads something he is trying to be respectful of without agreeing with. He handed them back and said, "Vivian, if I don't plow this ground in spring, the weeds will eat us alive before August." She put the notes back in the box. She didn't bring them up again for 14 years. Gerald died on a Tuesday in October of 1977. He had been complaining of headaches for a week. He was on the tractor doing the last fall tillage pass when it happened. The neighbors found the tractor running at the end of a row, and Gerald slumped forward over the wheel. He was gone before the ambulance reached the field. He left Vivian the farm, the equipment, a life insurance policy that covered most of the funeral, and a chest freezer full of beef from the 2 steers they had fed out that summer. He also left her the land. That was the thing that mattered. Vivian spent 1978 farming the way Gerald had farmed. She hired a man named Lech Caudle from Albion to run the equipment. She planted corn the way it had always been planted, plowed under in October, disked in April, planted in May. She made money. Not a lot, but enough. The loan officer at First National in Albion, a man named Howard Pratt, told her she was doing fine. "Keep doing what Gerald did," Howard said, "and you'll be all right." She kept doing what Gerald did through the fall of 1978. She kept her father's box of notes on the workbench in the shop. She read them again in December, the way she always read them in December, when the fields were empty and the days were short. And in January of 1979, Vivian Marsh drove to Lincoln and sat in the office of a soil scientist at the University of Nebraska named Dr. Elaine Forsberg. Dr. Forsberg was 44 years old, Norwegian-American, originally from the Sandhills, and she had spent the previous 8 years studying what happened to soil microbial communities when ground was tilled annually versus left undisturbed. She had published 2 papers in the Journal of Soil Science that nobody in Calhoun County had read. Vivian had read both of them. She had driven to Lincoln with her father's notes and her own farm soil tests from the past 10 years, and she spent 4 hours in Dr. Forsberg's office. Dr. Forsberg told her 3 things. First, the soil on Vivian's farm was losing its structure. The pore space that held water was collapsing under the repeated weight of tillage equipment. Vivian's 10-year yield trend, flat despite increasing fertilizer inputs, was consistent with this. Second, there was a practice called no-till planting that had been used experimentally in Kentucky and Ohio since the 1960s, with mixed results in wet climates, but with strong preliminary results in dryland regions where conserving soil moisture was the primary limiting factor. The concept was simple. You didn't plow. You planted directly into the residue from the previous crop. The soil was never disturbed. The fungal networks that connected root systems and moved water and nutrients through the soil stayed intact. The organic matter built up year by year instead of burning off when it was exposed to air by tillage. Third, if Vivian tried this, her neighbors would think she had lost her mind. Dr. Forsberg said it plainly, the way a scientist says something plainly, because she has seen it happen before. The social pressure in farming communities against doing something different was not trivial. Vivian should understand that the results would not be visible for 3 to 5 years. She would be farming with more weeds in the early transition period. Her fields would look rougher. The men at the elevator would notice and they would comment. If Vivian needed everyone around her to approve of what she was doing, this was not the approach for her. Vivian sat with that for a moment. She thought of her father's notes. She thought of the corner of the east field where the corn stalks had always rotted and the ground had always been better. She said, "Dr. Forsberg, what equipment do I need?" She drove back to Albion. She did not tell Lech Caudle what she was planning. She did not tell Howard Pratt at First National. She called a no-till equipment dealer in Grand Island that Dr. told Bootman Forsberg had recommended, and she ordered a used tie no-till drill from a farm in Kansas that had tried the practice for 2 years before the owner's wife made him go back to conventional because the fields looked too messy. The drill arrived in March. Lech came out to the farm that first Tuesday in April to do the spring tillage and found Vivian standing in the equipment shed next to something he didn't recognize. He knew what it was in the abstract. He had seen pictures, but nobody around Albion actually had one. "Vivian," he said, "what is that doing here?" "It's a no-till drill, Les." He took off his cap and looked at her. He was 53 years old, had been farming in Colfax County his whole life, and had worked for Vivian Marsh on and off since 1971. "You're not going to plow," he said. "Not this year." "Vivian, the weeds." "I know about the weeds." "Your corn's going to look terrible by July, you know that." "I expect it will look different," she said. "Not the same as terrible." Les looked at the drill. He looked at the fields through the open shed door. He put his cap back on. He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald wouldn't have done this," he said. "Gerald's not here to do it," Vivian said, "and I am." Les drove off without another word. He was back the next morning to help plant because whatever he thought of the decision, he was a man who showed up when there was work to do, and the work needed doing. He planted the first no-till corn in the south field on April 14, 1979. He didn't say much. He watched the drill drop seed into undisturbed ground, and he kept his opinion to himself. The story was at the elevator in Albion by the end of the week. Vivian Marsh is not plowing her fields this year, going to plant right into the corn stalks. Lakodal is running the equipment for her, and he says she's serious about it. It was at the diner by Monday. It had reached the co-op by Wednesday, and from there it went to the seed dealer and the feed store and the Tuesday morning booth at Mays, where 4 of the older farmers sat and drank coffee that had been on the burner since 6 and talked about rainfall and commodity prices and what their neighbors were doing wrong. A man named Art Koenig delivered the considered verdict at Mays on a Thursday morning in late April. "She's still grieving," Art said. "Gerald's been gone 2 years now, and she still hasn't come back to herself. Woman tries to run a farm alone. You see this kind of thing. She'll plow in June when the weeds come up and chalk it up to a hard lesson." The other 3 men nodded. They had seen this kind of thing. Widows making unusual decisions. It was not unexpected. In 2 seasons, maybe 3, there would be an auction at the Marsh place. First National would get the land. The equipment would sell at the sale barn, and somebody sensible would buy the farm and plow it properly. This was the story Colfax County told itself. A widow, 38 years old, trying to run her dead husband's dryland farm on untested science from a university office. A woman who had decided to stop doing the thing that everyone around her had done their entire lives. The county repeated it at every gas station, every field road conversation, every Sunday dinner for 6 months. Vivian heard about it. There was no way not to. She said nothing. She did not plow. The summer of 1979 was not kind to her. The no-till fields did look rougher. The corn came up in a tangle of residue and volunteer weed growth that made every farmer who drove past her place slow down and stare and shake their heads. The rows were harder to see. The cultivator passes that every other farmer made in June to knock down the weeds between rows were not available to her because cultivating would disturb the soil she was trying to protect. She used a herbicide program instead, the one Dr. Termer Forsberg had recommended, but it was expensive and the timing was harder to manage than she had expected. Her yield that fall was 11 bushels per acre below her 5-year average. She sat with that number at the kitchen table in October. 11 bushels. The bank note was still $28,000. She had Claire's nursing school to think about. She had the fuel bill and the equipment loan and the property taxes. 11 bushels below average was not a catastrophe, but it was not what she needed in the 2nd year of doing this alone. She called Dr. Forsberg from the phone in the kitchen. Dr. Forsberg was not surprised. She said this was consistent with the transition period they had discussed. The soil biology was rebuilding. The fungal networks were reestablishing after a decade of annual disruption. This would take 3 to 4 growing seasons. The herbicide program would get cleaner with experience. The yield would come back. Vivian asked her how sure she was. Dr. Forsberg paused. She said, "I'm sure about the soil science. I'm not sure about your specific farm. No one is. You are doing something that has not been done at scale in this part of Nebraska. The research says it should work. The research doesn't know your particular soil or your particular rainfall or your particular reed pressure. What I can tell you is that the mechanism is sound." Vivian closed her eyes. She thought about her father standing at the edge of the east field telling her the soil was alive. She thought about the corner with the old stockpile, that dark ground that had always outperformed everything else on the farm. "Thank you," she said. She hung up. She went to bed. She was back in the field at 5:30 the next morning. Art Koenig came out to her place unannounced in November of 1979. He was 61 years old, had farmed in Colfax County since he was 20, and had known Gerald Marsh since grade school. He sat at her kitchen table and drank the coffee she put in front of him, and he didn't start with small talk. "Vivian," he said, "that south field looks bad." "Some years are worse in transition," she said. "Transition to what exactly?" "To soil that holds water when the rain stops." Art set down his cup. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had farmed one way his entire life and whose father had farmed the same way before him, and from where he sat, Vivian was burning through Gerald's equity on a theory. "Vivian," he said, "I watched Gerald build that south field for 20 years. That ground is as good a piece of dryland corn ground as there is in this county. I don't want to watch you run it down." "I'm not running it down, Art. I'm rebuilding it." He looked at her. He had the look of a man who wants to say something else and is deciding not to. "You're going to keep it this," he said. "I am." He laughed. He came back twice more that winter, once in January and once in March, both times to repeat a version of the same conversation. The third time, Vivian told him plainly that she appreciated his concern and that she was done discussing it. He did not come back after that. He was not angry. He was something quieter than angry. He was genuinely worried, and the worry had nowhere to go because Vivian would not receive it. That night Vivian sat at the table and opened her father's notes again. She read the margin entries in Frank's careful, European-inflected handwriting. She looked at the soil test data she had been keeping since 1979, the organic matter percentages she was measuring every fall from the same 6 spots in the South Field. In 1977, the year Gerald died, the organic matter in the South Field had averaged 2.1%. In the fall of 1979, after one no-till season, it was 2.1%, the same. She was not losing ground. She was not yet gaining it. She was holding. She told herself that holding was enough for now. She wasn't sure she believed it. She went to bed. She was in the field at 5:30. By the spring of 1981, the South Field had changed in ways that were not in any yield report. The ground between the rows was different under her boots. It had a give to it that the fields she had farmed conventionally did not have. The earthworm count she had been doing every fall in a square foot of soil, a method Dr. Brown Forsberg had taught her, had gone from 6 earthworms per cubic foot in 1979 to 14 per cubic foot in the fall of 1980. The earthworms were rebuilding the pore structure that 20 years of tillage had compacted. They were doing for free, overnight in the dark, what no equipment could do. She began keeping a new notebook. Not her father's notebook, not Gerald's farm ledger, her own. She recorded the earthworm counts. She recorded the organic matter tests. She recorded the water infiltration rate, measured by timing how long it took a known volume of water to soak into the soil in a standard pipe, a method she had learned from a paper Dr. Forsberg sent her from a researcher in Ohio. In 1979, the water in that pipe disappeared in 8 minutes on the South Field. In 1981, it disappeared in 4 minutes. The ground was absorbing water twice as fast as it had before. Nobody in Colfax County knew any of this. They saw a farm where the fields looked rougher than everyone else's, where the rows weren't clean, where a widow was running a place that would have been better off in different hands. The spring of 1983 was wet, too wet. Every conventional farmer in the county sat through May watching their fields stay too saturated to plant, the tractor tires sinking in plowed ground that had no structure to hold its shape under load. Vivian planted her South Field on May 3rd before anyone else in the county, because the no-till ground drained fast and the surface crust that would have formed on tilled soil in wet conditions did not form on hers. She was done planting before Art Koenig's fields were dry enough to take a tractor. Her yield in 1983 was 14 bushels per acre above her pre-no-till average. She did not announce it. She sold the corn at the elevator in Albion, the same elevator where the men had laughed at her in 1979. And she said nothing about the bushels per acre number. She drove home and wrote it in her notebook. Then came 1984. The drought of 1984 started the way most Great Plains droughts start, quietly. A dry April, a May with half the normal rainfall. The corn that went in was planted into dry ground, and it germinated uneven and slow. By the 4th of July, the National Weather Service was calling it a significant drought event across a 6-county region. By the 3rd week of July, the air temperature in Colfax County had been above 95 degrees for 11 consecutive days, and the soil moisture in the conventional tilled fields had dropped to levels where the corn was beginning to fire. Corn fires from the bottom up when it's drought-stressed. The lower leaves go first. They turn yellow and then brown, and then they curl tight against the stalk like paper scrolling toward a flame. It is not subtle. You can see it from the road. Farmers started driving their fields. What they found in most of the county was bad and getting worse. The tilled soil had a crust on it that was sealing the surface against what little moisture was falling. The organic matter that would have held water in the soil profile had been oxidized away by 2 decades of tillage. When you pushed a probe into the soil in a conventional tilled field that July, the moisture reading dropped off to almost nothing in the top 8 inches. The roots were finding nothing to drink from in the zone where most of their feeding happened. A man named Leonard Schreiber, who farmed 300 acres south of Albion, sold half his standing corn crop as silage on July 19th because he could see it was not going to grain out. He lost $11,000 on the deal and was grateful to lose only that. Art Koenig's East Field, the one he had farmed the same way for 40 years, was showing corn that had rolled its leaves completely by the 20th of July. Rolled corn is corn that is pulling moisture out of its own leaves to keep the stalk alive. It is a last resort. When you see a field of rolled corn in the morning, before the heat of the day, the drought is already past a certain point. Art drove out to his east field on the morning of July 22nd and stood at the end of the rows and looked at his crop and did not say anything out loud. He drove home on the county road that ran along the north edge of Vivian Marsh's place. He slowed down. He stopped. He sat in his truck for a long time. Vivian's south field ran along that road for a quarter mile. What Art saw across her fence line did not make immediate sense to him. The corn was under stress, he could see that. It was not a perfect crop, but it was standing. The leaves on the lower stalks were yellowing at the tips, but they were not rolled. The soil between the rows, visible in the low angle of the morning light, was darker than any soil he had seen in the county in 3 weeks. There was a crust on his fields. There was no crust on hers. The surface looked like it could still absorb water, like it was still in conversation with whatever rain might come. He got out of the truck. He walked to her fence. He put his hand through the wire and pushed his fingers into the soil on her side. It was soft. It was cool. At 8 inches deep, it was noticeably moist. He stood up. He looked at his hand. He wiped it on his jeans. He looked down the row of her corn, and he understood something he did not want to understand. The same way a man understands a thing that requires him to reconsider a long time. He drove back to his place. He stood at his own fence and looked at his own corn. The leaves were curled. The soil was pale and cracked at the surface. He drove to his east field. He got out. He pushed his fingers into the soil between his rows. At 8 inches, it was dry. He drove back past Vivian's place. He sat on the county road for almost an hour. He did not go in. He did not go in. He did not honk. He just sat there and watched her field in the morning heat. Vivian saw his truck from the kitchen window. She recognized it immediately. She did not go out. After a while, he drove away. By the middle of August, people were talking about Vivian Marsh's fields in a different tone than they had ever used before. The laughter was gone. In its place was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of attention, the way a room goes quiet when something happens that nobody had predicted and everybody had to revise around. Farmers started driving past her place. Some of them parked on the shoulder of the road. Some of them got out and stood at her fence. Some of them pushed their fingers into the soil on her side the same way Art had, then went home and pushed their fingers into their own soil and compared what they felt. Not one of them came to her door, not for 3 weeks. The first person to come to her door was not a neighbor. It was a woman named Dr. Patricia Hensley, the district agronomist for the University of Nebraska Extension Service in a 4-county region, who had been hearing about Vivian's farm from Dr. Forsberg for 2 years. Dr. Forsberg for 2 years. Hensley had come out in June, before the drought had fully showed its character, and had spent a day walking Vivian's fields and taking soil cores and asking questions and filling a notebook. She came back on August 18th. "Vivian," she said when Vivian opened the door, "have you been out to see your neighbors this week?" "No," Vivian said. "I've been here." "People are stopping on the road. You know that. I've seen the trucks. Has anyone come to the door?" "Not yet." Vivian made coffee. Dr. Hensley sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook and said, "I have been trying to get dryland farmers in this part of Nebraska to look at no-till since 1976. I have given 47 presentations to producer groups. The last time I gave one in Albion, 12 farmers showed up, and 11 of them left before the question period." She paused. "What you have built out here, the numbers I have been taking from your soil, Vivian. This is what I have been trying to show people for 8 years. and I could not show it to them because I did not have a farm in their own county to point to. Now I do." Vivian drank her coffee. "When the rain comes back," she said, "they'll forget." Dr. Hensley looked at her. "Some will," she said. "Not all. What you have done here, the data you have been keeping, the organic matter trend, the infiltration rates, that is going to matter. It is already mattering." She paused. "Would you let me bring some producers out here this fall? Walk them through what you built?" Vivian thought about it. She said yes. 31 farmers came to her place in October of 1984. Dr. Hensley organized it. They walked the fields. Vivian showed them her notebook, the organic matter trend, from 2.1 to 3.6% over 5 years, the earthworm counts, the infiltration data. She showed them the yield records. She answered every question directly and without any particular satisfaction in being right, because she had never been trying to prove anything to them. She had been trying to build something. Art Koenig came. He was one of the last to arrive and one of the last to leave. He walked the fields without saying much. He looked at the soil test charts Vivian had taped to the wall in the shop. He looked at the earthworm numbers. He looked at the earthworm numbers. He looked at the infiltration rates. At the end of the afternoon, after the other farmers had gone, Art stayed behind. He stood near the shed door and did not look at her directly. "Vivian," he said. She waited. "I told Gerald in 1965 that his wife was too smart for her own good." He smiled at me then and said he knew. She didn't say anything. "I've been sitting in Maze for 5 years making a fool of myself," he said. "I would like to ask you about the equipment." She walked him through it. They were in the shed for an hour and a half. Art asked good questions, the kind that came from 40 years of farming and a mind that was still working even when it was wrong. He understood the soil. He had just never been shown this particular door. When he left, he stopped at the end of the driveway and turned back. "Vivian," he said, "who do I call about getting one of those drills?" She gave him the name of the dealer in Grand Island. She told him to mention her name. She watched his truck go down the county road. She went back into the shed and stood alone for a while. She was 43 years old. She had been farming without a partner for 7 years. She had spent 5 of those years doing something that nobody around her had believed in. And she had done it by herself, in the early mornings and the late evenings and the long Januaries when the notebooks were her only company. She had not tripled her acreage. She had not made the local paper. She had not given a speech at the co-op or written a letter to the Farm Bureau. She had just kept planting into undisturbed ground while the county watched and waited for her to fail. She went into the farmhouse kitchen. She opened her father's box and took out the notes. She read the margin entry she had read 100 times, the one Frank had written in 1957 in that careful handwriting. "The soil does not need to be broken. It needs to be fed. We have been breaking it for 50 years and calling it farming." She put the notes back in the box. She put the box back on the shelf. She had Claire home for Thanksgiving that year. Claire had finished her nursing degree in Omaha and was working at a hospital in Lincoln, and had come back to the farm for 4 days with a seriousness about her that reminded Vivian of Frank Nowak, her father, who had never not been thinking about something even when he appeared to be sitting still. On the second evening, they walked the south field after dinner, the way they had walked it when Claire was small. Claire was quiet for a while. She looked at the field in the low November light, the standing corn residue from the harvest, the dark, undisturbed ground between the rows. She said, "Mom, what was it like, the first year when it was going wrong and everyone was talking?" Vivian thought about it. She said, "It was like being certain of something you couldn't prove yet. You know it the way. You know it, the point is alive before it shows above the ground. It's there. You can't see it. Everyone around you is looking at the same empty dirt and telling you there's nothing there." Claire looked at the field. "Grandpa's notes," she said. "Yes." Claire picked up a handful of soil and turned it over in her hand. The earthworms were already retreating deeper for winter, but the soil structure was visible in the way it broke apart, not in slabs the way compacted soil breaks, but in crumbles, loose and dark and full of the small hollow spaces that years of undisturbed fungal threads had carved through it. "This is what he meant," Claire said. "Yes," Vivian said. "That's exactly what he meant." In 1986, the University of Nebraska used Vivian's farm as the primary case study site for a 6-state no-till research project funded by the USDA. Dr. Forsberg and Dr. Hensley both led portions of the study. They published a paper in 1988 in Agronomy Journal. Vivian was listed in the acknowledgments as a cooperating producer. She had declined co-authorship. She was not in the business of being known. She was in the business of farming. By 1990, 37 farms within a 40-mile radius of Albion had converted to no-till or reduced-till practices, most of them referencing Vivian Marsh by name as the reason they tried it. Art Koenig was among them. He farmed no-till from 1985 until he retired in 1999. His east field, the one that had rolled its leaves in the drought of 1984, had an organic matter reading of 3.2% when he turned the lease over to his son-in-law. He told his son-in-law never to plow it. Vivian farmed the Marsh place until 2001, when she turned 60. She expanded the operation not by adding acres, but by deepening what the existing acres could do. By the time she handed the farm to Claire's daughter, Nora, the South Field organic matter was at 4.9%, more than double what it had been the year Gerald died. In the 2012 drought, the worst drought on record in the region since the 1930s, Nora's fields held moisture while neighboring farms across 3 counties failed to grain out. Nora had been farming no-till since she was 18. She had never known the farm any other way. Vivian kept the notebooks, all of them. Her father's box, her own records from 1979 onward, the infiltration logs, the earthworm counts, the organic matter trend spanning 22 years of undisturbed ground. She kept them in the kitchen of the small house she built on the west side of the property when she handed the main farmhouse to Nora. In 2004, the Nebraska Sustainable Agriculture Society gave her a recognition award at their annual meeting. She did not attend. She sent Nora in her place with a written statement that Nora read to the room. It was one sentence. It said, "My father told me in 1957 that the soil does not need to be broken." He was right about the soil. We were wrong about what breaking it meant. The room was quiet. Then people stood up. Vivian heard about it that night when Nora came home. She asked how the food was. Nora laughed and said the green beans were overdone. Nora's son is 14. His name is Caleb. He can read the infiltration test the way some kids read a stopwatch. He knows which corner of the south field was his great-great-grandfather Frank's original stockpile corner, the one that started all of this. He goes out there sometimes by himself and kneels down and picks up the soil and looks at it the way you look at something that has been quietly doing its work for a long time without being asked. Last fall, Nora walked Caleb through running the no-till drill by himself for the first time. He was the age Vivian had been when she first went to the university extension office with her father's notes. The drill dropped into undisturbed soil, and the residue folded around the opener, and the seed went in, and the ground closed behind it without a seam. Nora watched him go and said something quietly into the afternoon air. The soil does not need to be broken. It needs to be fed. The same words Frank Nowak had written in the margin of an extension pamphlet in 1957. The same words Vivian had read at a kitchen table in the winter of 1979. The same words Nora had grown up hearing the way some families grow up hearing grace. 4 generations. 1 notebook. 1 farm that held its water through every drought because a woman in 1979 decided to stop doing the thing that everyone else called farming and started doing the thing her father had always believed was possible. What do you see when you look at a field that hasn't been plowed? Most people see a mess. They see weeds and residue in a farm that belongs to someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Art Koenig saw a grieving widow running her husband's land into the ground. The men at Mays saw the predictable collapse of a woman trying to do a man's job with a professor's ideas. The loan officer saw risk. The neighbors saw disorder. Then the drought came and they saw what was underneath all of it. They saw dark soil in a county of pale hardpan. They saw corn standing in a week when everybody else's was rolling. They saw a farm that had been building its own water storage for 5 years underground, invisibly, below the line of what the county could see from the road. Vivian Marsh saw her father's handwriting on a margin note from 1957. She saw a soil test that matched what Frank had described before Frank had the words to describe it. She saw a drill that could plant into undisturbed ground and a woman from Lincoln who had the data to back what her father had always believed. Everyone else saw a widow making a mistake. She saw the thing her father had been trying to build for 30 years and never had the equipment for. She saw a farm that could be something different. She saw, underneath all that rough-looking, unplowed, county laughing at her ground, a living system that just needed to be left alone. She left it alone. She fed it. She farmed it without breaking it. And on a July morning in 1984, when every other farmer in Colfax County was standing at their fence looking at corn that was dying, Art Koenig pushed his fingers through Vivian's fence wire and felt cool, soft, moist soil at 8 inches deep, and understood that the woman the county had been laughing at for 5 years had been right the whole time, and had known it, and had gone ahead anyway. That is what 5 years of being right in silence looks like when the drought finally comes to show everyone what was always there. I keep thinking about Art Koenig pushing his fingers through that fence wire. Not the drought, not the yield numbers, not the research papers or the university awards. Just that one image. A man who had farmed his whole life, who had sat at May's diner for 5 years, saying Vivian Marsh was running her husband's land into the ground, reaching through a wire fence on a July morning and feeling cool, moist soil 8 inches down, feeling with his own hand the thing he had refused to believe with his mind. That's what stays with me about this story. Not that Vivian was right. She knew she was right. That part wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the 5 years she had to be right about something in silence, alone, while the people around her performed certainty about her failure. What Vivian did that I think about most wasn't the no-till drill, or the soil tests, or the earthworm counts, though all of those mattered. It was the honesty she started with. She went to Lincoln in January of 1979, not because she was rebellious or stubborn or trying to prove something. She went because she had her father's notes and 10 years of her own soil tests, and she was willing to follow what those numbers were telling her, even when it led somewhere nobody around her was willing to go. That's a different thing than courage in the dramatic sense. It's quieter than that. It's the willingness to be honest about what you actually know, and to act on it, even when the social cost of acting on it is that the men at the diner think you've lost your mind. Her father had that same quality. Frank Nowak didn't have the scientific vocabulary for what he was observing in that corner field with the stockpile, but he was paying attention, and he was honest about what he saw, and he wrote it down. He passed that habit to Vivian, and Vivian built a 22-year soil record out of it that became the foundation of a USDA research project. The intellectual honesty of one Polish immigrant with a 6th-grade education, transmitted through a composition notebook and a daughter who was paying attention, ended up changing how dryland farmers in 6 states thought about their ground. And then there's what those 5 transition years actually cost her. The 11-bushel deficit in 1979. The banknote. Claire's nursing school tuition. Art showing up uninvited in November to tell her the Southfield looked bad. The Tuesday morning booth at May's. None of that was abstract. It was her life, and it required something that most people give up on when it gets specific and daily and grinding. The willingness to keep doing the right thing past the point where it feels like it's working. Past the point where the people you respect have written you off. Past the point where the proof is still underground and invisible, and the only thing you have is a 4-minute infiltration reading and 14 earthworms per cubic foot, and a notebook from 1957 that says the soil does not need to be broken. That combination, knowing what's true, being honest enough to follow it, and being willing to keep following it when the ground has not yet shown you what you built, is the whole story. Not just Vivian's story. Most of the things worth building work exactly like that. The proof is underground for a long time. The people around you see a field that looks messy. You keep planting anyway. And then the drought comes. And Art Koenig reaches through your fence. And you already know what his hand is going to find.